The silence out here wasn't empty. That was the first thing I learned. In the city, silence was just the absence of noise, a dead space between sirens and the rumble of the subway. But here, on a ranch that felt like the forgotten edge of the world, silence was a living thing. It was made of the whisper of wind through dry grass, the distant, mournful call of a hawk, the creak of old wood settling under the relentless sun. It was a silence that got inside you, that forced you to listen to the frantic, useless chatter of your own mind. For the first month, I thought it would drive me mad. I had come here to escape. A classic, pathetic cliché. My life in Chicago had imploded with spectacular efficiency. A job lost to downsizing. A relationship ended with the quiet brutality of a text message, and an apartment lease I could no longer afford. My uncle, a man I'd seen maybe 5 times in my life, owned this sprawling cattle ranch in Wyoming. A pity-fueled phone call resulted in an offer, a room, 3 meals a day, and a small wage in exchange for being a general hand. "It'll put some hair on your chest," he'd said, his voice crackling over the line, and I was too desperate to argue. I packed 2 suitcases with clothes entirely unsuitable for manual labor and fled west. My primary job, it turned out, was to be an observer of my own incompetence. I was clumsy with tools, terrified of the horses, and generally useless in every practical sense. The other hands were a blur of dusty jeans and knowing smirks. They weren't unkind, but there was a clear and unbreachable distance between us. I was a tourist in their world, a temporary problem to be tolerated. And then there was Cole. Cole was the foreman. He didn't smirk. He didn't tolerate. He simply watched. He was the center of gravity around which the entire ranch orbited. He moved with an economy of motion that I, with my flailing limbs and nervous energy, found both fascinating and intimidating. He was tall, built of long, lean muscle that was corded and obvious under his worn flannel shirts. His face was all harsh angles and sun-weathered skin, but his eyes were a startlingly pale gray, the color of a stormy sky over the plains. They missed nothing. When he looked at me, which was rare in those first few weeks, I felt pinned and analyzed, like a bug under glass. His voice was the second thing I learned about the silence. It was low and gravelly, used so sparingly that when he did speak, everyone stopped to listen. It wasn't a voice for shouting. It was a voice that cut through the noise with its quiet authority. The first time he spoke directly to me, beyond a one-word instruction, I nearly dropped the bucket of feed I was carrying. I'd been trying to mend a section of fence, tangling myself in the wire like a fly in a spider's web. He had approached without a sound, his shadow falling over me. "You're holding the tensioner wrong." It wasn't a criticism, just a statement of fact. I fumbled, my face flushing hot with embarrassment. "Sorry, He didn't wait for my excuse. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering mine on the tool. His touch was brief, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the Wyoming wind. The scent of leather, sweat, and something clean and earthy, like freshly turned soil, clung to him. He adjusted my grip, his fingers firm and warm against my own. "Like this," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against my ear. "Pull steady. Don't fight it." He let go and stepped back, his gray eyes fixed on my hands. I did as he said, and the wire stretched taut, humming with tension. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and walked away, leaving me with the ghost of his warmth on my skin and the sound of my own heart hammering in my ears. That was the beginning of my obsession. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was more like a magnetic pull. I started watching him. I learned the rhythm of his days. Up before dawn, a solitary figure on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the sky bleed from bruised purple to pale gold. The way he moved among the horses, a language of soft clicks and gentle touches that they understood perfectly. The set of his jaw when he was calculating something, the cost of feed, the threat of a coming storm. I watched him from across the dusty corral, from the shadows of the barn, from the window of the cookhouse. I was a ghost at the edge of his life, collecting details like a magpie collects shiny things. I cataloged the way a rare, small smile would touch the corner of his mouth when one of the ranch dogs did something foolish. I noted the faint lines that fanned out from the corners of his eyes, etched there by sun and concentration. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture that signaled his mood, a A slight straightening of his spine meant annoyance. A relaxed slump of his shoulders meant the day's work was done and had been done well. He was a man of few words, but his body spoke a language I was becoming fluent in. My internal analysis was relentless. Every interaction, no matter how brief, was dissected for hours. He passed me a hammer. Did his fingers brush mine on purpose? He said, "Good work today." Was that genuine praise, or just a platitude offered to the useless city boy? He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary across the dinner table. What did it mean? I was a detective in a case with no crime, searching for clues in a landscape of my own yearning. My mind spun endless theories, each more hopeful and more ridiculous than the last. He was probably just a decent boss. That was the most logical explanation. But my heart, that traitorous organ, refused to listen to logic. It thumped a frantic, desperate rhythm whenever he was near. The touches, when they happened, were my most prized pieces of evidence. They were always practical, always justifiable. A hand on my back to guide me out of the path of a spooked horse. His arm brushing against mine as we stood side by side, looking over a map of the property. Once, he'd steadied me when I slipped on a patch of mud, his hand gripping my bicep with a strength that left me breathless. Each touch was a spark in the dark, a fleeting moment of connection that I would replay in my mind until it was worn smooth. I lived for those accidental collisions, those brief, necessary points of contact. They were the only things that made me feel real in this vast, lonely place. I was an observer, yes, but for a few stolen seconds, I felt observed, too. And the thought that his unreadable gray eyes might see something more in me than just an awkward city kid was enough to keep me going. It was a fragile, foolish hope, but it was all I had. The storm came in late August, a furious, black-bellied beast that rolled in over the mountains without warning. The sky turned a sickly shade of green-gray, and the air grew thick and heavy, charged with a nervous energy that even the cattle seemed to feel. Cole's voice cut through the rising wind, sharp and clear, dispatching orders. We had to move the herd from the west pasture to the shelter of the valley before the hail started. It was a frantic, chaotic scramble. Rain began to fall in thick, cold sheets, plastering my hair to my scalp and my thin jacket to my skin. I was on foot, trying to head off a few stray yearlings that had broken from the main group. They were panicked, their eyes wide and white. I was slipping in the mud, my city boots completely useless, when Cole appeared on his horse, a dark silhouette against the bruised sky. "Get in the north cabin," he yelled over the roar of the wind. "Check the roof and bar the shutters. I'll finish up here." There was no room for argument. I just nodded, my teeth chattering, and began to trudge up the hill toward the small line cabin used for emergencies. The cabin was tiny, one room with a stone fireplace, a cot, and a few dusty shelves. The wind howled around it, rattling the single window in its frame. I managed to force the heavy wooden shutters closed and bolt them, plunging the small space into near darkness. I found a lantern and some matches, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get it lit. The small, flickering flame cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. I found a pile of firewood and kindling and set about building a fire, grateful for the simple, distracting task. By the time I had a small blaze crackling in the hearth, the storm had broken in earnest. Rain lashed against the roof, and the wind screamed like something in pain. I didn't know how long I sat there, huddled in a threadbare blanket, listening to the storm and worrying. Every crash of thunder made me jump, my mind filled with images of Cole out there, exposed to the elements. It felt like an eternity before the cabin door was thrown open with a gust of wind and rain, and he stumbled inside, drenched and exhausted. He slammed the door shut, leaning against it for a moment, his head bowed. Water streamed from his hair and the brim of his hat. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah," I managed to say. "You?" He just grunted in response, pulling off his hat and running a hand through his soaked, dark hair. He peeled off his heavy coat and hung it on a peg by the door, where it immediately began to form a puddle on the floorboards. In the flickering lamplight, he looked less like the untouchable foreman and more like just a man. A tired, cold man. He came over to the fire, sinking down onto the floor with a weary sigh, holding his hands out to the flames. We sat in silence for a long time, The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the fury of the storm outside. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't the empty space of the corral or the awkward quiet of the dinner table. It was a shared silence, a small pocket of stillness carved out of the chaos. "My father built this cabin," he said eventually, his voice so quiet I barely heard him. He was staring into the fire, his gray eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Built it with his own 2 hands," said a man always needs a place to ride out a storm. I was stunned. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to me. "It's a good place," I replied, my own voice hushed. "It's solid." He nodded slowly. He was a solid man. A pause. He loved this land. Said it was honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. It can be beautiful and it can be brutal, sometimes in the same day. But it's always real. He finally turned his head and looked at me. The firelight softened the harsh angles of his face, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something unguarded in his eyes. A deep, settled sadness. "I miss him." Just 3 words. But they felt like a confession, a gift of vulnerability I had no idea what to do with. My own carefully constructed walls, the ones I'd built to protect myself from my own pathetic hopes, began to crumble. This man, this stoic, silent man, had just shown me a piece of his heart. "I'm sorry," I said, because it was all I could think of to say. He looked away, back at the fire. It was a long time ago. He picked up a small piece of wood and began to turn it over and over in his hands. The silence returned, but it was heavier now, filled with the weight of his admission. I felt an overwhelming urge to say something more, to offer some piece of myself in return. I came here because I didn't know where else to go," I blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. My whole life just fell apart. I felt like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, and then one day I just couldn't do it anymore. My face was hot, and I stared down at my own hands, twisted in the rough fabric of the blanket. He didn't say anything for a long moment. I risked a glance at him. He was watching me, his expression unreadable as always, but the intensity of his gaze made my skin prickle. "Pretending is exhausting," he said, his voice a low rumble. And in that moment, I knew he understood. Maybe not the specifics of my life, my loneliness, my feelings for him, but the core of it. The crushing weight of a life lived out of alignment with who you really are. We stayed up for hours, talking. Or rather, I talked, and he listened. I told him about Chicago, about my stupid graphic design job, about feeling like a ghost in my own life. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving my face, occasionally asking a short, perceptive question that cut right to the heart of the matter. He offered no advice, no judgment. He just gave me the rare, precious gift of his attention. When the storm finally quieted to a gentle patter on the roof, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, a deep exhaustion settled over me. There was only one cot. An unspoken question hung in the warm, close air of the cabin. "You take the cot," he said, his voice firm, already spreading his damp coat on the floor near the hearth. "No, you should." Leo, he used my name. He rarely used my name. It sounded different in his mouth, solid and real. "Take the cot." I didn't argue. I crawled onto the narrow bed, still wrapped in the blanket. The cabin was dark now, save for the faint orange glow of the embers. I could hear the sound of his breathing, slow and steady in the quiet. He was only a few feet away, but it felt like a chasm. And yet, I had never felt closer to him. I had never felt closer to anyone. For the first time since I'd arrived in Wyoming, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt safe. I fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, a quiet rhythm that anchored me in the dark. The day after the storm, the air was washed clean. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the world smelled of wet earth and pine. The tension of the previous night had dissipated with the morning sun, replaced by a new and unfamiliar awkwardness. We rode back to the main house in near silence. The easy intimacy of the cabin seemingly vanished. It was as if we had tacitly agreed to pretend it never happened. Cole was the foreman again, and I was the useless hand. But something had shifted. I could feel it. When his eyes met mine, there was a new awareness there, a flicker of the vulnerability he had shown me by the fire. And when he handed me a pair of dry work gloves, his fingers brushed against mine, and this time, I was sure it wasn't an accident. The tipping point came a week later, during lunch in the cookhouse. A few of the other hands, a pair of loudmouth brothers named Jed and Caleb, were joking around. Their humor was usually harmless, if juvenile, but today it took a sharper edge. They were talking about a new schoolteacher in town, a young man who was, in their crude estimation, a little too neat. The jokes escalated, growing uglier with each punchline, laced with slurs I hadn't heard since high school. I felt my stomach clench. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, hoping to become invisible, my body rigid with a familiar, sickening shame. I waited for Cole, sitting at the head of the table, to join in with a quiet chuckle, to affirm his place in their world. He didn't. The silence that fell from his end of the table was sudden and absolute. It was heavier than any shout could have been. Jed, mid-laugh, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere and trailed off, looking at Cole with a nervous expression. Cole slowly placed his fork down on his plate. The small clinking sound was deafening in the sudden quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at the brothers. He just stared at a spot on the far wall, his jaw tight. "That's enough," he said. His voice was flat, cold, and utterly final. The air went thick with tension. Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We were just fooling around, Cole." Cole finally moved his head, his pale gray eyes pinning Caleb with a look so glacial it seemed to drop the temperature in the room. "I said," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft, "that's enough." No one spoke for the rest of the meal. The brothers shoveled their food down with their eyes averted and left as soon as they could. I didn't dare look at Cole, but I could feel the weight of his presence, a protective shield I had never expected. He hadn't done it for me, not really. He had done it because it was his code, his sense of decency. But it felt personal. It felt like he had stood up and drawn a line in the sand, and I was, for some reason, on his side of it. Later that afternoon, he found me in the tack room, where I was clumsily trying to repair a broken bridle. The air was thick with the rich scent of leather and saddle soap. He didn't say anything, just started working on a saddle nearby, his movements methodical and sure. The silence stretched between us, but it was different from the awkward quiet of the morning after the storm. This was a loaded silence, humming with unspoken words. The space between us felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. "You all right?" he asked eventually, his back still to me. It was the same question he'd asked in the cabin, but this time it meant something entirely different. He wasn't asking about the storm. He was asking about lunch. He was asking about me. My hand stilled. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm fine." He stopped his work and turned to face me. He leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms over his broad chest. His gray eyes searched mine, and I felt that familiar sensation of being seen, truly seen, right down to the bone. "You don't have to be," he said quietly. And that was it. That was all it took for the last of my defenses to shatter. The careful indifference, the pretense of being unaffected, it all just fell away. My throat felt tight, and I couldn't have spoken if I'd wanted to. I just looked at him, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he could see everything I was feeling written plain on my face. The fear, the gratitude, the desperate, aching want. He held my gaze for a long, breathless moment, and in the depths of his stormy eyes, I saw not pity, not curiosity, but a reflection of my own yearning. A quiet, steady recognition. He knew. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if coming to a decision, and then he turned and left the tack room, leaving me alone with the scent of leather and the thunder of my own heart. The question wasn't if something was going to happen between us anymore. The question was when. That evening, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sit still. The energy buzzing under my skin was too much to contain. After the other hands had turned in, I found myself drawn to the cavernous quiet of the main hay barn. The air inside was warm and sweet with the smell of dried grass, and dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight slanting through the high windows. It was a place of peace, a cathedral of stillness. I climbed the ladder to the loft and sat at the edge, my legs dangling over the empty space, trying to breathe, trying to quiet the frantic noise in my head. I didn't hear him approach. One moment I was alone, the next his presence was there behind me, a solid warmth in the cool night air. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. I could feel him, a magnetic pull on my senses. My heart, which had been racing, suddenly felt like it had stopped altogether. He came and sat beside me on the edge of the loft, his shoulder and thigh pressing against mine. The contact was electric, a current that shot straight through my body. He didn't speak. We just sat there, shoulder to shoulder in the moonlight, looking out at the dark, sleeping ranch. The silence was absolute, profound. It held everything. All the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the pent-up tension of the last 2 months. I am here now. My breath catches in my throat. This is it. This is the moment where everything changes or everything breaks. My mind is a frantic storm of what-ifs, a screaming chorus of fear and hope. What if I read it all wrong? What if this is just friendship? The thought is a cold spike of dread. But then I feel the warmth of his leg against mine, the solid reality of him, and the fear recedes, replaced by a deep, trembling certainty. Slowly, deliberately, he lifts his hand. I watch, mesmerized, as he reaches for my own, which is resting, white-knuckled, on the rough wooden floorboards between us. His fingers, calloused and strong, gently close over mine. He doesn't just take my hand. He carefully, methodically, laces his fingers through my own. The fit is perfect. His thumb strokes the back of my hand, a small, soothing gesture that unravels the last of my anxiety. This is not the touch of friendship. This is something else entirely. This is a claim. He turns his head, and I finally meet his gaze. In the pale moonlight, his eyes are luminous, silver pools that hold no secrets. I see it all there. The same want, the same fear, the same undeniable pull that has been tormenting me for weeks. He doesn't have to say a word. I understand. He holds my gaze as he gently pulls our joined hands up, raising them to his lips. He presses a soft, warm kiss to my knuckles, his eyes never leaving mine. The simple, tender gesture shatters me. A sound, half sob, half gasp, escapes my throat. He then uses our linked hands to gently pull me toward him, guiding me, walking me into the kiss. His other hand comes up to cup the back of my neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below my hairline. His lips meet mine, and the world just stops. There is no frantic urgency, no desperate grab. It is slow. It is sure. It is the most honest thing I have ever felt. His lips are firm and soft at the same time, tasting faintly of coffee and the clean night air. It's a kiss of discovery, a question and an answer all in one. It speaks of long-held restraint and quiet patience. It says, I see you. I've been waiting. My own hands, one still laced with his, the other coming up to rest on the solid muscle of his chest, tremble against him. I can feel the steady, strong beat of his heart under my palm, a rhythm that matches the frantic drumming of my own. I lean into him, surrendering to the overwhelming relief of it, the sheer, impossible rightness of this moment. All the loneliness, all the uncertainty I've carried for so long, simply dissolves in the warmth of his mouth, in the steady strength of his hands. This is not a mistake. This is a homecoming. The next morning was a study in exquisite torture. Waking up in my own narrow bed, the memory of the hayloft felt like a fever dream. The scent of hay still clung to my clothes, a tangible reminder that it had been real. At breakfast, the air between us was so thick with unspoken things I felt like I could barely breathe. He sat in his usual spot at the head of the table. I sat in mine near the end. We didn't look at each other. Not once. He was the foreman again, quiet and contained. Every nerve in my body screamed with confusion. My internal monologue was a frantic, looping reel of panic. He regrets it. It was a moment of madness in the moonlight. He's ashamed. He wishes it never happened. The silence that had once felt so full of possibility now felt like a judgment. I picked at my eggs, my stomach a tight knot of anxiety. I felt the casual glances of the other hands, and paranoia bloomed in my chest. Did they know? Could they see it on me? I felt branded by the memory of his kiss. I escaped the cookhouse as soon as I could, volunteering for the most solitary job I could think of, checking the fence line at the far eastern edge of the property. I needed space. I needed to think. The ride out was a blur. The familiar landscape, the vast sky, the steady gait of the horse beneath me, none of it could soothe the turmoil in my mind. Was I just a temporary diversion? A city boy to experiment with before he went back to his real, stoic, lonely life? The thought was a physical pain. I had allowed myself to hope, and now the potential for heartbreak was immense. By the time I reached the fence, my hands were shaking. I dismounted, my legs unsteady, and leaned against a fence post, staring out at the endless expanse of sagebrush, feeling smaller and more lost than ever before. I heard the sound of hoofbeats, and my heart leaped into my throat. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. A few minutes later, he reined his horse in a few feet away from mine. He swung down from the saddle with his usual fluid grace and walked toward me. He stopped a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans, his hat shadowing his face. The silence stretched, amplifying the frantic beat of my own heart. I couldn't look at him. I just stared at a loose strand of barbed wire, bracing myself for the words that would end it all. Last night was a mistake. Let's just forget it happened. Leo. His voice was low, and it made me flinch. I squeezed my eyes shut. Look at me. It wasn't a request. I took a shaky breath and forced myself to lift my head and meet his gaze. His expression was serious, his gray eyes clear and steady. There was no pity in them, no regret, just an unnerving intensity. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing directly in front of me. He reached out, not to touch me, but to gently trace the line of the wooden fence post just beside my head. I woke up this morning, he began, his voice a quiet rumble. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. He let the words hang in the air between us. He looked down at his hand on the post, then back up at me. I am not a man who makes mistakes, Leo. Not about things that matter. Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees felt weak. It wasn't a mistake. It mattered. All the frantic anxiety, all the fear, it just evaporated under the steady warmth of his gaze. He took his hand from the fence post and gently took mine. His grip was firm, reassuring. He wasn't lacing our fingers together this time. He was just holding my hand, a simple, declarative act. A promise. I'm not good with words, he said, his thumb stroking my palm. Never have been. I don't know what this is, or where it's going. All I know is he paused, searching for the right thing to say. All I know is I don't want it to stop. The temporary nature of my job, the fact that my real life was waiting for me back in Chicago, suddenly felt like an impossible hurdle. My time here had a deadline. This fragile, beautiful new thing we had just found had an expiration date. The fear of losing it, now that I knew it was real, was a cold knot in my stomach. What happened when my time was up? Would I just pack my bags and go, leaving him here with the memory of a summer storm and a kiss in the hay? The thought of returning to my old life, to the gray anonymity of the city, felt like a prison sentence. We stood there for a long time, hands joined, just looking at each other under the vast Wyoming sky. The test wasn't going to be gossip from the other hands or navigating our new dynamic at work. The test was me. It was my choice. Stay in this world that was not my own, with a man who was just beginning to feel like my anchor, or run back to the familiar emptiness I had fled from. For the first time, the choice felt real. It wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about a life. The decision, when it came, wasn't a lightning bolt of clarity. It was a slow, quiet dawn. Over the next few weeks, Cole and I navigated a new reality. It was a relationship built in stolen moments. A shared glance across the corral that held a universe of meaning. His hand brushing the small of my back as he passed me in the narrow hallway of the bunkhouse. A quiet hour spent on the porch after everyone else was asleep, just sitting side by side, not needing to speak. He taught me things. Not just how to properly mend a fence or saddle a horse, but the names of the constellations in the ink-black sky, the way to tell the weather by the direction of the wind. He was showing me his world, and I was falling in love with it, just as I was falling in love with him. One evening, he drove me out to a high ridge overlooking the entire ranch. We sat on the hood of his old truck, watching the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. My uncle called today, I said into the comfortable quiet. Asked when I was planning on coming back. I felt him tense beside me. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on the horizon. And what did you tell him? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. This was it. The conscious choice. The moment to leap or to retreat. I took a breath, the cool evening air filling my lungs. I told him I wasn't. He finally turned his head to look at me, and the guarded expression on his face softened into something I couldn't quite name. It was relief and hope and a deep, quiet joy that made my own heart ache with the beauty of it. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say he was happy. He just reached out and cupped my jaw, his calloused thumb stroking my cheek. He leaned in and gave me a slow, deep kiss that tasted of promise. It was a kiss that said stay. It was a kiss that said home. Our new beginning wasn't marked by a grand declaration, but by a simple, quiet act. The next morning, I woke up not to the jarring sound of my alarm clock, but to the soft light of dawn filtering through a different window. I was in Cole's room, in his bed. He was already up, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the small space. I lay there for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch waking up, but they sounded different from in here. They sounded like my life. I got up and pulled on my jeans, walking into the main room of his small foreman's cabin. He was standing at the stove, a mug of coffee already waiting for me on the small wooden table. He turned and gave me that rare, small smile that still made my stomach do a slow flip. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. "Morning," I replied, my voice thick with sleep. I took the mug, my fingers brushing his. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my skin. I leaned against the counter next to him, and we stood in a comfortable silence, sipping our coffee as we watched the sun crest over the distant mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. There were no questions left to ask. There was no uncertainty. The frantic chatter in my mind, the constant companion of my old life, was finally quiet. It had been replaced by a deep, settled peace. I was no longer an observer, a tourist in someone else's world. I was here. I was a part of the silence, a part of the sunrise. I looked over at the man beside me, his profile outlined in the morning light, and I knew, with a certainty that reached all the way down to my bones, that I was finally, truly home.